From social media to the streets, many people in Zimbabwe are calling for
Draped in Zimbabwe's flag, the pastor's plea for change went viral.
Mugabe has warned there'll be no Arab Spring in Zimbabwe.
Zimbabwe and its people are in unknown territory.
Hello, I'm Richard Gisbert, and you're at The Listening Post. Here are some of the media stories we're covering this week. Zimbabwe, where one man's online activist is another's cyber terrorist. Greece is cutting the number of TV channels on the dial. Turkey, after the failed coup, just keeps on arresting journalists. Yemen, where being a reporter comes with all kinds of complications. And
breaking news that's horribly tragic.
The news channels that seem to have a distant relationship with the news. Political movements that end up taking to the streets often have a trigger. Many Zimbabweans say the current political unrest there was sparked by an online video posted 5 months ago by a pastor named Ivan Mawarire. The video inspired the hashtag #ThisFlag, and it launched widespread demonstrations over a range of political and economic grievances. Having held power for 36 years, President Robert Mugabe and his ZANU-PF party have dealt with dissent before, but the government cannot control the narrative the way it used to. State-owned media remain influential, particularly in the rural areas where more than 60% of the population lives. But social media, once largely confined to urban areas, is now penetrating those key rural demographics, effectively breaking the state media monopoly. The question now becomes, how far will the Mugabe government go with the pushback? It's already trying to classify some social media movements as a form of cyber terrorism. Our starting point this week is Harare. What is striking about the demonstrations in Zimbabwe these days are the flags. They seem to be everywhere. But they are not to be mistaken for simple symbols of nationalist pride or solidarity with the government. Displaying the Zimbabwean flag in 2016 amounts to an act of defiance that has its roots in a simple hashtag.
The story of this flag campaign, is now well known. The pastor, Mr. Mawarire, he posted a video of himself engaging in a monologue about the flag.
This flag, this beautiful flag.
And how the flag had been violated by corruption, misgovernance. And this flag campaign was quite successful in a way in bringing the country to a shutdown at some point in May. But it was not solely responsible for that. There were a whole range of other players as well.
For the first time, you're seeing very different networks who are all sending out their own messages, and it's growing in volume. I think that's what's very interesting about these hashtag movements. They mostly come about on Facebook and then being extended to Twitter and also WhatsApp.
Many have questioned how effective social media movements on platforms like Facebook and Twitter would be in Zimbabwe because of the difficulty in reaching rural areas where most Zimbabweans live. The bedrock of the ZANU-PF government's support lies in those areas, where internet access is limited and voters are much more reliant on state-controlled television and radio for their news than urbanites are. However, those people do have phones, and phone messaging apps like WhatsApp are, in an unprecedented way, distributing political content. What starts out as dissent spread amongst urban Zimbabweans on social media sites, then migrates and is shared over WhatsApp, which is used throughout the country.
It is very critical for us to understand the fact that Mugabe's mainstay in terms of support is in the rural areas. And so what we've been doing together with other leaders, progressive leaders, we are coming up with strategies and ways through which we're going to penetrate the rural areas.
This is now a nationwide conversation. And yes, it may not be going to the rural areas in the form that we see in the urban areas, but you are certainly seeing that WhatsApp is sharing that information where You have people who are sending it to their relatives out in rural communities who are saying, oh, okay, this is what's happening. Okay, this is what people are talking about.
One of President Mugabe's members of parliament disputes that, saying the numbers just aren't there for the opposition, and blaming agitators from the outside.
The few people that are on social media are in the diaspora, and the few that are on the ground in Zimbabwe are only occupying 1 or 2 parts of Harare, and Harare is only one of 10 provinces in Zimbabwe, which demonstrates to you that there's no traction to speak of. If anything, this is a sign, an indication that the bulk of the Zimbabwean people in here are supportive of the government of President Robert Mugabe.
One of those now in the Zimbabwean diaspora is the preacher who gave the hashtag its start. Ivan Mawarire fled the country after being charged with trying to overthrow the government, and now posts from the relative safety of the US. Under normal circumstances, the Mugabe government strictly controls what goes out on television, but usually tolerates criticism in print, which is much less influential. But these are not normal times, and there's been a spate of arrests involving print reporters trying to cover the protests, including journalists from papers like the Daily News and Newsday. The state-controlled broadcaster ZBC remains firmly on message, not just on the politics, but also the coverage.
Some sections of the media are being used to push the regime change agenda, and Comrade Mugabe told the Western-sponsored papers to tell their handlers that he's still in power despite all their attempts to remove him.
Protesters made their feelings about ZBC known last week, torching one of its vehicles. State-owned newspapers such as the Herald have been playing their part, echoing the government's terror narrative, rhetoric that's in line with a new cybercrime bill that, if passed, will empower police to intercept communications, seize equipment, and jail so-called abusers.
You have to draw a distinction between online activism and cyber terrorism. Online activism simply is somebody sitting there pushing an agenda, an idea through non-violent means online. But cyber terrorism is what you've seen in Zimbabwe. People organizing each other on social media to intimidate other people. The moment you begin to instill fear in people for purposes of advancing a political agenda, it becomes cyber terrorism.
And they're using these terms, of course, like cybercrime. What cybercrime? Cyber terrorists. They are labeling us terrorists because we are expressing ourselves. They are anticipating that they're going to silence the citizens through enacting draconian policies such as the cybercrime bill. That is nonsense. That is nonsensical.
The use of the term terrorism is not new by the government of Zimbabwe. In fact, during the struggle to end colonial rule in Zimbabwe, the government of the last colonial rulers, that's a guy called Ian Smith, routinely used the term terrorism to delegitimize the freedom fighters.
They are the ones who are today supporting terrorists. Combat terrorism or no terrorism. Terrorism and intimidation.
What the government is doing today is exactly a replica of what the government did then. It's a strategy of describing these protesters as, people without a cause.
People without a cause? Rebels? What they do have is a hashtag. And these days, that can be enough for a political movement to get off the ground, mobilize the masses, hit the streets, and the headlines. For Zimbabweans, particularly those in rural areas previously dependent on state media for information, more and more alternative news sources have presented themselves, and not just online. Voice of the People is a privately owned radio station and online platform that provides critical reporting from afar. Repeatedly denied an official broadcast license, its team of journalists sends its reports to Radio Netherlands. They are broadcast back into Zimbabwe via a transmitter in Madagascar. Other outlets based abroad to circumvent restrictive media laws include Nahanda Radio and TV Online. It operates from the UK and is headed by exiled journalist Lance Guma. Guma used to be with Radio SW, which was also based in Britain but closed in 2014 because of what its founder called donor fatigue. And Studio 7 is an online radio platform that's part of the U.S. state-funded Voice of America. It broadcasts into Zimbabwe from Washington. Other media stories that are on our radar this week: there's been no let-up in the media crackdown that's unfolded in Turkey since the failed coup that took place 6 weeks ago. Authorities have arrested more than 40 journalists this past week. 23 of them were from the Kurdish-language daily paper Azadiya Welat, whose head office in Diyarbakir was raided by police. 9 other journalists arrested were from media organizations such as Hurriyet, Zaman, Yeni Shafak, and others. 13 employees of the state-owned broadcaster TRT were brought to court, charged with helping the Gulen movement that the AKP government has blamed for being behind the coup. As the Paris-based media rights group Reporters Without Borders put it, the newly detained journalists, combined with those already in prison before the abortive coup, make Turkey the world champion in imprisoned media personnel. In Athens, the Syriza government of Prime Minister Alexis Tsipras has announced the results of a license auction process aimed at culling the number of private television channels in Greece. Greece, with a population of just 11 million, currently has 8 national TV channels. 4 of those will have to go off the air within 3 months, having lost out to higher bidders. Among the winning bidders are 2 existing channels, Sky TV and Antenna TV, along with 2 new players, Alter Ego and a construction group called Toxotis. The channels facing closure are Star, Alpha, Art, and Epsilon. 2 existing channels, Macedonia TV and Mega TV, were disqualified because of debt issues.
This government has a tendency towards totalitarian practices.
Mega TV's news director said the government is getting rid of private channels it does not like. However, the Syriza party has long argued that the channels, the conglomerates that own them, and the banks that fund them comprise an unelected triangle of power that led to the collapse of the Greek economy. That argument was buttressed in 2012 in the cache of U.S. diplomatic cables released by WikiLeaks. One from the U.S. Embassy in Athens asked, how can all these media outlets operate profitably? They don't. They are subsidized by their owners, who use the media primarily to exercise political and economic influence. The state broadcaster in Kosovo, RTK, has come under attack, apparently, over its coverage of a border dispute with neighboring Montenegro. This past week, a hand grenade was detonated just outside the home of the channel's Director General, Mentor Shala. The previous week, multiple grenades were thrown at the channel's headquarters. There were no injuries in either incident. Police have yet to make any arrests. A group calling itself Rugovasit, a term used for inhabitants of the Rugova Mountains west of Kosovo, has claimed responsibility for both attacks. Those mountains are in territory that could conceivably be handed over to Montenegro should an agreement between the 2 governments be reached. RTK has come under sustained criticism for failing to properly cover the negotiations over the border and has been accused of acting as a mouthpiece for Kosovo's current coalition government. Prosecutors in Paraguay have opened an investigation into allegations that a journalist may have been spied upon by the Paraguayan military. This story goes back a couple of months to a report published in one of the country's leading newspapers, ABC Color, written by Rosana Escobar. In the piece, Escobar reported the military's resources were being used by the wife of a senior army general for her own private business affairs. ABC then published a story alleging that Escobar's mobile phone had been tapped into by the military, putting at risk the sources the reporter had been in contact with. The paper accused General Luis Gonzaga Garcete of being behind the spying operation in order to identify the whistleblower who leaked the initial story. That prompted the public prosecutor to launch an investigation into the use of military intelligence equipment on reporters. The Association of Paraguayan Journalists called the alleged military spying a serious attack on freedom of expression. With peace talks bogged down, nearly 3 million people displaced, and a crying need for humanitarian aid, Yemen is a story that needs to be told. When Houthi rebels from northern Yemen seized power last year, many of them attacked and intimidated critical journalists who, in their eyes, are agents of the enemy, the Saudi-supported former government and the Saudis themselves. The Houthis also took over much of the country's media infrastructure, including the state broadcaster Yemen TV. Meanwhile, another channel, also calling itself Yemen TV, the Saudi-approved version, is beaming the ousted government's side of the story into the country from its studios in Riyadh. It's no wonder that when Yemeni reporters go out into the field, they're often asked, whose side are you on? And when you put this question to Yemenis, what media outlets do they trust? And which version of Yemen TV do they believe? Many of them will tell you none of the above. The Listening Post's Will Young now on journalism caught in the crossfire in Yemen.
Two Yemeni journalists telling a story of one nation from two cities, from two very different perspectives. Divergent views on a conflict that's tearing Yemen apart.
يمدونهم بالمال والسلاح والرجال ليقتلوا إخوانهم.
هم الآن بيحسبوا إنه رسالة للعدو إن إحنا خلاص انهرنا.
Dalia Diel presents her show Mocha Coffee on the Sana'a-based Al Yemen Al Yum satellite channel. Her program focuses on social issues, but a war is being waged on Sana'a from above, and politics is never far away.
The war is affecting everyone, and many things that affect the Yemeni people are obstacles for journalists too. Normally, I would go into the field to report on people's experiences and living conditions, but I cannot do this now because of the war. My show covers social stories, but it is our fate that we must now tackle political issues. I mean, we would be live on air while bombs were dropping. So tackling these things is a must. We are at the heart of events.
But in this conflict, not all Yemeni journalists are able to report on their country from their country. Jamil Ezzaldeen's political talk show airs on Yemen TV. Not the state broadcaster based in Sana'a. That channel was taken over by the Houthis when their forces stormed the capital nearly 2 years ago. Eldeen is now based in Riyadh, where he and other Yemeni journalists have received funding from the Saudi government. In facilities provided by the Saudi Education Ministry, a new Yemen TV broadcasts back to the homeland, a channel that mirrors and opposes its Houthi rival.
When the Houthis entered Sana'a, the first thing they did was attack our TV station. We survived 3 days of constant shelling. Their aim is to terrorize the media so that no one will dare to criticize, condemn, or say a word about the violence against journalists. It is almost impossible to communicate with the Houthis. They don't see us as journalists or even as human beings. There is no professional media to reflect people's struggles, opinions, or problems. Yemeni journalists are forced to work in secret. They could be arrested, jailed, put on trial, or blackmailed at any moment.
The Houthis' decade-long insurgency escalated last year when they ousted President Abd Rabbu Mansur al-Hadi, who sought refuge in Saudi Arabia. Since then, the Saudis have led an offensive that has pushed Yemen to the brink of humanitarian disaster. If conditions for the media were tough under President Hadi, they've taken a sharp turn for the worse during the current war. Hundreds of violations against journalists and media organizations have been recorded, including killings, kidnappings and torture. 10 journalists held in a Houthi prison since June last year began a hunger strike in May, protesting their arrest and maltreatment. Last August, during the height of the Saudi air war, Houthi captors held 2 journalists, Yusuf al-Izari and Abdullah Qabil, in a location coming under heavy Saudi bombardment. Their families say they were being used as human shields.
After the Houthis took control, journalistic freedom hit rock bottom. The minute you mention Al-Masdar online or any independent or undesirable media outlet, access is denied immediately. They use violence towards journalists who do not subscribe to their version of events. I personally managed to escape 2 kidnapping attempts by the Houthis. The second time, 9 of my colleagues were kidnapped. Since then, I have left Sana'a and moved to Mareb to cover events from here.
We can't say that it is only the Houthis that restrict freedom in Yemen. In fact, there are violations of freedom and journalists' rights in general. The situation is not much better outside Sana'a, where if you're not with the opposition, you have no access to information either. Each side of the conflict classes journalists who follow the opposing side as enemies, spies, or even conspirators. But the Houthis are worse than the others because they are the ones that banned websites and arrested more journalists than the others. We blame them more because they are the ones in power.
Amid the scapegoating of journalists, the conflicting narratives, and the polarized and highly partisan press, Yemeni's trust in the media is dwindling. According to a study by a Yemeni think tank in April, 59% of Yemenis consider objective information to be non-existent, with more than a quarter trusting none of their local media sources. The independent news website Al Masdar Online was ranked highest, but still, only 19% of Yemenis questioned said they trusted it.
The lack of trust stems from the immense amount of news and rising number of media outlets. Each side of the conflict starts its own media outlet, which means there are too many, to the point that readers can't trust them anymore. With the current complications and divisions, you can't create a balanced story with both sides. But still, you need to be professional about the way you cover events. Even if you don't have the whole picture, at least cover one side of the story with professionalism.
People watch everything. They watch the Saudi-based Yemen TV,
من مجوس الفرس الروافض المتمردين قوات الحوثي
as well as Houthi-affiliated Al Masira. Why? So they can decide for themselves which is more credible. Naturally, a lot of people do not accept Yemen TV from Riyadh. Saudi money has bought off many people, and it is perfectly capable of buying media channels as well. Everyone knows that Yemen is facing a massive media onslaught from Saudi Arabia. We try to counteract this despite our modest resources.
بشكل أو بآخر.
We are grateful to Saudi Arabia for hosting us here and allowing legitimate Yemeni media outlets to broadcast into Yemen. This allows us to push back against the flood of media backed by Iran. We are not affected by any external influences. We are immune to that. We know how popular our channel is, from the reaction of the Houthis to our programs, and also through social media and the opinions of people in the streets. Yemeni society today is divided because of the Houthis.
Yemeni citizens are victims of the current events. We have a big problem in Yemen nowadays, a disaster. The media has become highly chaotic and manipulated by agendas. It is no longer a media that presents facts. A journalist looking for work will research the agenda of the institution he aims to work for and then write the same way. If you listen to Houthi media, you would think that they are triumphant in all areas. If you listen to the opposition, you would believe that they are winning every battle. We cannot get a clear picture of what's happening.
As two TV channels and a factional media fight for the right to represent Yemen, Yemen's story is being torn between two poles. Journalists caught in the middle are finding themselves under fire, while a nation unravels.
And finally, a new satirical video from the U.S. tackles a topic familiar to viewers of The Listening Post. What is it exactly that the media consider news, and what drives their editorial choices? A stand-up comedian, Remy Munassifi, sits in the anchor chair and reflects on the media's obsession with trivia, like Donald Trump's table manners and his latest Twitter fight, when there's real news that's going uncovered. Produced in collaboration with a libertarian magazine, Reason, this video is called This is CNN. And it singles out the Atlanta-based news network, but this is an issue afflicting news channels far and wide, and not just in the U.S. We'll see you next time here at The Listening Post.
Yield for breaking news. Ed? Thank you. Breaking news that's horribly tragic. If your children are watching, we warn you it's graphic. Our lead story tonight atop the report was Donald Trump eating chicken with a knife and a fork. Plus, This Trump supporter is 11 years old, so what are his thoughts on? Are you reading the scroll? Who he thinks is best fit to lead us? Would he have voted for Obamacare when he was a fetus? I really don't mean to step on your staging, but it seems like there's war. Some battles are raging. Reporting the news. Is that not our vow? You know what? You're right. I'll cover it now. Well, the war continues. Yes. On Twitter as planned. No. Between Donald Trump and a Littleton man. Oh the fighting is fierce. No sight of the end. Follow it all on our app. You're watching CNN. Look, I really just think that there's stuff that we missed, like... Is that true? Does that list exist? Cover the news. Shake up the ranks. The real news. Thanks. Well, it's a hidden document upon which fate swings. Yes, fortune cookie fortunes. Who's writing those things? A man with no parachute just took a dive in today's most newsworthy instance of one flung from the sky. I know this is tough, so forgive the belittling. Rome is engulfed and we're sitting here fiddling. Executive orders, economy stuttering. These are the stories we're sitting here covering. There's war in Afghanistan, hurt in Iraq. You'd need $5 footlongs for turkey this bad. Cut his mic. Breaking news.